Hey everyone, and yes, this is yet another new wave horror film, but this time it comes from a YouTube content creator who started out making comedy sketches.
We're getting Reggie a prom date.
Later moved into horror shorts.
I saw you.
Oh honey, that's not me, that's my replacement.
And has now become the creator of one of the best horror films of 2026, the young and highly promising director Kerry Barker.
I'm talking $1 billion.
But before we get into the review, let's first talk about who Barker actually is, for those who may not know. And if you're not interested in that part, you can skip to the timestamp shown on the screen, where the discussion will focus entirely on the film itself. That said, I should point out that the creator's background is genuinely important here, because it helps us understand exactly who we're dealing with. Let's begin.
Oh, what's up, man?
Who is that fucker? What the fuck?
I'm just a guy, man. I don't know. I died.
Kerry Barker is yet another filmmaker who grew from making YouTube videos into directing feature films. Another example would be Kane Parsons, who started out creating experimental Backrooms shorts and is now preparing to release a full-length adaptation of Backrooms in collaboration with A24. There is a strong chance that project could also generate major hype and earn recognition from both critics and audiences. Fingers crossed. There are also less successful examples, where a creator's directorial debut failed to make much of an impact. One of them is Chris Stuckman, a well-known movie reviewer whose debut film Shelby Oaks didn't achieve significant success with general audiences, although critics received it fairly warmly. Another example would be Danny Filippo and Michael Filippo, the creators of the comedy action YouTube channel Raka Raka. Their breakthrough came with the feature-length debut Talk to Me, which was well received by both audiences and critics. However, the film never really became a worldwide phenomenon, and while the reviews were strong, they weren't overwhelmingly exceptional. Then there's Kyle Mooney. He originally became known for absurdist YouTube videos, later joined Saturday Night Live and eventually entered mainstream cinema as one of the writers behind Brigsby Bear. The film earned praise from critics for its originality and was warmly embraced by audience for its unusual and heartfelt atmosphere. Unfortunately, Kyle's first major directorial effort, Y2K from A24, ended up being a box office disappointment. The movie received fairly restrained reviews and mixed reactions overall. Critics felt the nostalgic concept had potential but was ultimately underdeveloped, while audiences responded rather coldly. One of the more recent examples is Iron Land by YouTuber Markiplier. Fans received the film quite warmly, but professional critics were noticeably more divided. Many described the movie as overly stretched, and its average rating currently sits around the 6 out of 10 range. Looking at all these examples together, it feels fair to say that, at least for now, Kerry Barker is the first truly successful filmmaker to emerge from YouTube culture. Someone who managed to earn recognition from both critics and audiences at the same time. And personally, I think he earned that recognition completely. Yes, the film has its flaws, which we'll talk about later, but overall it's still a genuinely strong piece of work that has already sparked a lot of discussion. What also makes the film especially interesting is how relevant it feels today, at a time when relationships between men and women seem increasingly unstable and strained. And while the movie focuses less on the material side of relationships and more on toxic emotional obsession, the broader issues surrounding modern relationships are still very much present throughout the story. The film pulled me in so deeply that after leaving the screening I remained in a trance-like state for about an hour, and I immediately felt the urge to learn more about the director himself. Because of that, I watched all of his short horror works, as well as some of his earlier sketches. After that, it became interesting to draw parallels between Obsession and his early work in order to understand how Barker's directorial style actually developed. Let's take a closer look and start with his early sketch productions. In these, you can already notice rough uses of absurd humor, as well as early ideas involving magical wishes and overdose. elements that would later reappear in Obsession. In the roommates sketches, Barker heavily uses shaky camera work, characters speaking directly to the camera, and commentary-style dialogue, similar to The Office. It's clear that at this stage he was still searching for his own unique visual identity. However, the only element that truly carried over from these sketches into his horror work is awkward, absurd humor. After the sketches, Barker took a break for almost 3 years, and in 2022 he suddenly returned with a completely different genre, his first horror short film. And it's here that we begin to clearly see many of the techniques later used in Obsession. The image of a girl lurking in the shadows, her sudden physical reactions as tense anticipation abruptly shifts into a quick exit from the frame. Interestingly, many of the actors who appeared in his comedy videos also returned in Obsession in supporting roles. For example, the actor who played Ian, the protagonist's friend, appeared in almost all of Barker's earlier videos. The actress who played the shop clerk in The Coupon and the friend's girlfriend in Warnings later played the magical wand shop clerk in Obsession. In the short film The Chair, the main actor later plays one of Bear's friends in Obsession. This short already shows the development of Barker's signature absurd character behavior, sudden shifts between screaming, emotional breakdowns, and calm silence. Later, In the Neverett would elevate this style of performance to a more professional level, while Barker himself refined his directing approach with much greater confidence and skill. At this stage, a clearer recurrent image also begins to form, a strange, obsessed girl transformed by dark magic or supernatural events, which ultimately causes suffering for her boyfriend. Another interesting technique Barker uses is the off-screen voice of a loud, hysterical girl, while the camera focuses on a man reacting to her voice. This contrast is also later used in Obsession. Even the note "Forever Together" begins to feel thematically connected to the relationship between Nikki and Bear, especially considering that the desire only loses its power after the death of one of the characters. With each new work, Barker's cinematography gradually becomes more static, with increasingly tight and confined shots. This is a filming style he would later use extensively throughout Obsession. This further enhances the sense of immersion in the narrative and creates an even stronger feeling of anxiety and claustrophobic tension for the viewer. In the comedy sketch Text Me When You Get Home Safe, there are already elements of horror and the early seeds of the idea that would later become Obsession. The story of one person's fixation on another and the constant need for control, which would be fully developed in his debut feature film. The pulse walk technique from Warnings is also reused in Obsession, but here the walk appears much more pronounced and almost hypnotic in its effect. In his next project, Kerry Barker steps up to a new level by creating a near feature-length film, Milk and Cereal, shot in the found footage format for only $800. It becomes a breakout hit among YouTube horror shorts. In my opinion, this is one of his best works, naturally second only to Obsession. The film's style and concept are reminiscent of the Creep franchise featuring Mark Duplass, where a character hires people to film with him, only for his true dangerous nature to eventually be revealed as he turns on his victims. With this project, Kerry Barker firmly proves that he is a talented creator of atmospheric horror, a skilled editor, director, and screenwriter capable of building tension and compelling narratives. The acting duo of Kerry Barker and Cooper Tomlinson gradually develops strong on-screen chemistry, evolving from early appearances into performances that feel genuinely natural and convincing. After another horror project, Barker temporarily steps away from the genre and makes an experimental sci-fi comedy. As they say, before the silence comes the storm. In Fly Me to the Earth, the characters buy a ticket to the moon for $50,000 in order to live there, but they don't have enough money left for a return ticket back to Earth. This concept later becomes one of the narrative directions in Obsession, where the protagonist, after making wishes, is no longer able to undo anything. The short film is initially presented in a comedic and absurd tone, but midway through, Barker introduces produces a signature shift into tense, unsettling atmosphere and a sense of hopelessness and emotional abyss, underscored by dark ambient music. There are also strong similarities between the final scenes of Fly Me to the Earth and Obsession, which Kerry Barker almost directly mirrors. At the moment when the main character finds a way to use the stolen ticket, which was supposed to serve as a bridge back to Earth or a chance to fix his mistake, his friend, due to stupidity, panic, or an attempt to help, commits an irreversible action. This destroys the plan, ruins the ticket, and completely eliminates any hope of escape. In Obsession, Ian deprives his friend Bear of the last chance of salvation by making a first impulse wish, $1 million. In the end, this sense of hopelessness leads to a fatal catastrophe. In both films, Cooper's characters are unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster the main protagonist is trapped in. In Fly Me to the Earth, the idea of an ideal place to live, the moon, and in Obsession, the idea of an ideal relationship with Nikki, which Bear dreams of, both end in the collapse of illusion and a tragic outcome. Similar ideas can also be found in the recent film The Drama by Christopher Borgli, which I've already covered in a video on my channel. If you're interested, you can check it out. And at this point, we are finally getting close to discussing Obsession itself. Now armed with some background knowledge of Kerry Barker's work, it becomes much clearer where all these strange elements in his debut film come from. The trademark of the film Obsession's success was the marketing campaign built around the magical love-binding wand, One Wish Willow. Another major factor was the captivating, almost hypnotic facial expressions and highly expressive performance of the film's breakout star, Indy Navarrete, who already drew massive audience attention through trailers released before the theatrical premiere. A significant role was also played by Kerry Barker's YouTube fanbase. However, the biggest hook, in my opinion, was the unconventional idea of combining the familiar melodrama-driven social theme of emotionally dependent romantic relationships between men and women with the horror genre. The result is an explosive mix that offers a fresh perspective on the horror of relationships. Altogether, this worked strongly in Barker's favor. The film built high expectations and, importantly, fully delivered on them rather than collapsing under its own ambitious concept. As is known, the idea for the film came to Barker after watching an episode of The Simpsons, in which Homer purchases a monkey's paw that grants 3 wishes, each one leading to disaster. And now, for anyone who didn't fully understand the ending, it becomes clear that the film also revolves around 3 wishes, made by 3 different characters. Bear's first wish could only be corrected by a wish made by another person, but his friend instead wishes for money, and this sudden gift of $1 million also ends in shock and tragedy. Finally, the third wish, made by Nikki, that Bear would love her more than anyone else, despite everything she has done, closes the loop. She remains the sole survivor, with blood on her hands, and ultimately bears responsibility for everything. In my opinion, this is the harshest punishment imaginable, and the one she least deserves. Earlier in the review, I mentioned that modern relationships are one of the key social issues, a true plague of contemporary society. This was one of the main motivations behind Barker's decision to make a film about this topic, but through the lens of horror in order to emphasize its importance. The director asks a central question: how far can a person go in their fixation on someone else? And he presents this state as a metaphor for unhealthy, manipulative relationships. Barker has also noted that in the internet era, genuine human connection has become increasingly rare. His protagonist, a withdrawn nice guy, is so afraid of rejection that he gives into his own selfishness and uses a magical artifact, completely stripping his love interest of free will. From this, we can conclude that the true antagonist of the film is the protagonist himself, rather than the demonized and toxic Nikki, who is essentially just a hostage of someone else's desires. However, through Nikki's behavior, the film also reflects a segment of society that cannot exist without a partner. People who refuse to respect personal space, who selfishly control their significant other, attempt to treat them as property, constantly feel jealousy and engage in abusive relationship patterns. either through dominance or excessive submission, just to avoid losing their partner. In extreme cases, such individuals may even develop self-destructive or suicidal tendencies when the relationship ends. The storyline involving the cat and the poisoning functions here according to the principle of Chekhov's gun. If an element is shown in the beginning, it must inevitably fire later. At the start, the protagonist is presented as someone who is rather careless toward other people and living beings, and as a result, he is bound to face consequences for it. Due to his negligence, his cat dies after swallowing pills. This death becomes the film's first warning. At that moment, Bear experiences guilt for the first time and begins seeking sympathy from others. However, the problem is that he never truly undergoes internal growth. Instead of accepting responsibility, he continues searching for someone who can fill his emotional void and relieve his pain. In the end, he finds this through destructive love, and Bear's fate becomes a mirrored reflection of his cat's fate. After the wish is granted, Bear's life becomes controlled by Nikki, who is obsessed with him. He himself turns into a helpless being, becoming emotionally dependent on her in the same way the cat depended on him, and ultimately dies from the same pills. The cat was unaware of the danger of the pills. It died without understanding what was killing it, and throughout most of the story, Bear behaves in a similar way. He fails to notice how destructive his wishes are, his emotional dependency, and his fantasy of ideal love. Therefore, the final suicide does not feel like a sudden act, but rather the completion of a symbolic arc that began with the cat's death. Another important message from Kerry Barker is the idea of being true to yourself, not only in romantic relationships but in human relationships in general. You should not confuse desire with reality, because trying to change a person or their feelings toward you will almost always backfire. In the end, the truth inevitably comes out and hits you hard, often leading to serious consequences. It's important to be honest with yourself and with others. You shouldn't hesitate too much. It's better to openly express your feelings without fear of rejection. Even if the truth hurts, it prevents deeper internal suffering, makes you less vulnerable to painful realizations, and ultimately helps you mature. Besides, your soulmate might actually be much closer than you think. Someone who truly fits you and won't damage the relationship. But people often choose incompatible partners and later face the consequences of their own mistakes. At the same time, it should be noted that these ideas in the film are somewhat naive and surface level, but within the horror framework they still work in a very sobering and harsh way. On the technical side, one drawback is Barker's slight shift away from the slow burn style typical of his short films toward a more conventional jump scare approach, using sudden screams and sound effects that shock the viewer. These techniques sometimes feel a bit cliched and predictable during moments of calm. However, all of this is compensated by the performances of the two lead actors and their incredible chemistry. In addition, the claustrophobic, tightly framed camera work is gripping and holds your attention until the very end. A special mention also goes to the hypnotic ambient soundtrack, with sharp shifts in mood, from calming to oppressive and tense. The film was shot in just 18 days on a budget of around $1 million and has already grossed about $85 million worldwide. It's still running in theaters and has effectively earned back nearly 100 times its budget. This is a staggering success and yet another example that, even with relatively small budgets by film industry standards, it's still possible to create high-quality, creative, balanced and gripping cinema if the idea ends up in the right talented hands. Another young director added to the roster of the modern wave of filmmakers. I think I've said everything that could be said. Oh yes, be careful what you wish for. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like and hit the notification bell if you'd enjoy my videos. Stay with me, thank you for watching, see you soon. Ciao.
Alright, let's go.